The paranormal is a very polarizing subject. There are those who are believers, those who deny its very plausibility, and those who remain firmly on the fence about the whole thing. And it's often said that skeptics are just people who haven't had an experience of their own yet. And that's fair. This next story combines elements of everyone who fits into those three categories. A family experiencing terrifying events in their home, those who are uncertain of their credibility or perhaps wary of what they might discover, and those who, to this day, are convinced that it was all just a hoax. On the 50th anniversary of one of the most controversial cases that's ever come to light, why don't you judge if this was just an elaborate deception, or if what went on in this house was indeed extremely strange? The ghostly phenomena at 328-330 Chase Street in West Pittston, Pennsylvania, the home of Jack and Janet Smurl, garnered an abundance of media attention, in large part because of the presence of demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren. Even 3 exorcisms weren't enough to expel the suspected demonic force there from the home. And while skeptics said the occurrences were due to a prank or an outright hoax, the events taking place there resulted in a best-selling book, The Haunted by Robert Curran, as well as a film by the same name. So what exactly happened in the Smurl home? On the 50th anniversary of the first indications of paranormal activity there, let's take a closer look. The home itself was built in 1896 and situated on a quiet street in a middle-class working neighborhood. The Smurls were living in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, with Jack, a Navy veteran, working as a neuropsychiatric technician. Their lives were upended when Hurricane Agnes struck in 1972, leaving devastation in its wake and forcing the Smurls from their home. At the time, Agnes was the costliest hurricane to ever hit the United States, as well as claiming 128 lives. Jack's parents, John and Mary, bought the fixer-upper on Chase Street in 1973 for $18,000. Jack and Janet would move into the duplex with them, with John and Mary occupying the right half, and Jack, Janet, and their 2 daughters, Dawn and Heather, living on the left side. The entire family took on the task of redecorating and remodeling, and for their first 18 months there, all was serene and cheerful. It was in January of 1974 when a spate of mysterious happenings began to take form. First, a strange and unexplainable stain appeared on a brand new carpet, followed by a television set bursting into flames. Water pipes would repeatedly burst even after being repaired. A new sink and bathtub in the refurnished bathroom displayed prominent scratches, as if they had been clawed at, as did the newly painted woodwork. By 1975, the oldest daughter, Dawn, began to see what she described as people floating around inside her bedroom. The Smurls did their best to reconcile these events in their own minds, and simply tolerate the peculiar things that popped up from time to time. In 1977, Janet gave birth to twins Shannon and Karen, and as the new arrivals were welcomed into the home, the amount of odd activity increased. Unplugged radios would suddenly turn on at ear-piercing volume, drawers would be found open and closed for no reason, footsteps were often heard on the stairs, and toilets would flush on their own. Acrid odors would permeate the house, and empty rocking chairs on the front porch would rock and creak as though someone was sitting in them. Most disturbingly, Jack would often feel the gentle touch of something unseen. By 1985, these incidents would take on a more sinister and bizarre quality. John and Mary next door would hear loud, abusive language coming from next door, though Jack and Janet were not in the midst of an argument, and the house was often icy cold despite the heat being turned up. In February, Janet heard her name being called a number of times when she was alone in the basement, and 2 days later, an entity made its first appearance. It first showed itself to Janet in the kitchen, and was described as perhaps 5 feet 9 inches tall, totally dark with no facial features, but in a clear human form. Most frighteningly, the figure then passed right through the wall, only to appear to her mother-in-law Mary in the adjacent apartment. Then the activity became more violent and dangerous. On the night 13-year-old Heather was to receive her confirmation, a ceiling light held in place by 14-millimeter bolts crashed down near her little sister Shannon, who was doing her homework at the kitchen table. She was able to move just enough to avert disaster. One evening in June, after a romantic night together, Janet was pulled violently off their bed, while Jack remained paralyzed there, choking from a foul odor that swept through the room. The family dog, a German shepherd named Simon, would suffer physical abuse, as he would be picked up, tossed about, and sometimes thrown in a sadistic manner. This would be accompanied by the sight of phantom dogs running through the house. Raps and scratching would be heard inside the walls, bedspreads would be found shredded, and heavy footsteps would be heard pacing through the attic. At one point, Shannon would be tossed out of her bed and thrown down the stairs, and on occasion the unmistakable sound of what was described as a snake's hiss would be heard. The activity would not be limited to the Smurls' presence in the house, as neighbors would hear screams and odd noises coming from the home when they were away. In time, some of them began to experience paranormal activity in their own houses, and this is when the Smurls decided to take a more aggressive posture toward the phenomena. In January of 1986, Jack and Janet made the decision to contact Ed and Lorraine Warren after they had been made aware of their vast experience in such matters. When the Warrens arrived, they were accompanied by psychic Rosemary Frew, who at the time was also a registered nurse. They began by getting background information with standard questions about the family dynamics, their religious beliefs, and whether they had ever practiced Satanism or used a Ouija board or engaged in any activity that might draw something negative to their home. The Smurls, devout Catholics, assured them they had not. The walkthrough of the house began, and the Warrens and Frew reconvened with the Smurls, stating they felt a bedroom closet was the portal through which entities present had entered their realm. They further stated that 4 malevolent beings were indeed present, 2 of them women, one being a teenager, a man who died in the home or on the property, and the last being an actual demonic entity. As it seemed on the surface that these beings had not been summoned or previously attached to the Smurls, it was surmised that they had laid dormant for a number of years, and they had re-emerged to draw emotional energy from their daughters as they entered puberty. Efforts were made to entice the demonic entity to reveal itself, using spiritual means that included playing tapes of religious music and prayer, but 2 attempts to do so failed. The only reaction the provocation induced was a shaking of a mirror and some dresser drawers, as well as a television emitting a strange whitish glow. These manifestations were ended by continued prayer and use of holy water. During one of the prayer sessions, Ed Warren described a mucus-like, smoky-type substance that began to whirl and materialize on the mirror, spelling out filthy obscenities, telling me in no uncertain terms, "You filthy bastard, get out of this house." After the Warrens departed to regroup, the phenomena grew in strength and audacity. The rapping on the walls turned to loud pounding, and both Jack and Janet were physically assaulted by being slapped and bitten. Items began to disappear with no explanation. Janet at one time used an old tapping method to contact the evil being, asking for 1 tap for yes and 2 for no in response to a question. When it was asked if they were there to do harm to them, she received 1 loud tap in response. Meanwhile, Jack by this time had encountered 2 spectral females that he described as wearing colonial-era clothing. The nadir for the activity came when both Jack and Janet were sexually assaulted, Jack while watching a baseball game on TV, by a succubus appearing as an old woman with a young woman's body, whose eyes were red and gums were green, and Janet by an incubus during an event in which she claimed she was paralyzed and could not fend off her attacker. During one visit, Ed Warren was choked by an invisible force and suffered some severe flu-like symptoms. Noises were heard in the walls, resembling those made by a pig. The Smurls claimed they attempted to seek help from the Catholic Church, but their pleas went unheeded despite assurances from the Diocese of Scranton to consult with experts in the subject. A Father O'Leary offered to assist, but it was discovered he did not exist, and it was thought he was merely a manifestation of the demon. Making matters worse, Jack's mother suffered a devastating heart attack at home, while at the same point in time black masses would float throughout the home, accompanied by freezing temperatures. The Warrens contacted Bishop Robert McKenna, who at that point had conducted around 50 exorcisms for them. Bishop McKenna was a traditionalist, but also a sedeprivationist, holding belief that popes from John to Francis have not attained fullness of the papacy. Therefore, he's not bound to follow guidelines governing a rite of exorcism, and he performed them in traditional Latin. The rite was conducted, which enraged the demon greatly. After its completion, their daughter Karen fell ill with a peculiar fever that threatened at one point to claim her life. Dawn managed to escape being raped by the entity, and both Janet and her mother-in-law Mary displayed signs of physical attack on their arms by way of slashes and bites. Ed Warren described this as the second stage of demonic control, oppression. This, if not stopped, could lead to possession and ultimately death. A second exorcism was conducted in late spring of 1986, but it proved futile as the demon not only accompanied the family to a vacation in the Poconos, but harassed Jack at his job. It became clear that no place was safe for them as the attachment phase had begun. With no help coming from the church, the Smurls made the bold choice to appear on television to tell their story. Hidden behind a screen to protect their identities, they submitted to an interview conducted by host Richard Bay of the Philadelphia talk show People Are Talking. This seemed to further anger the demon, as when they returned home, Janet was lifted off the floor and thrown against a wall. The entity later appeared to Jack as a creature resembling a pig standing on 2 legs. Janet reported a hand coming up through a mattress and grabbing her by the neck. And once again, Jack was sexually assaulted. Risking total ridicule, but feeling their story needed to be told, an interview was scheduled with the Wilkes-Barre Sunday Independent newspaper. With that, their privacy ended, as the media, the curious, and the skeptical all descended on their home for a look-see, an interview, or the opportunity to investigate. The backlash was swift and harsh from skeptics, including some neighbors, who felt the whole story was a hoax and being perpetrated in order to profit off book deals and potentially films. The skeptical organization PsyCop was especially assertive, seeking to visit the house, but after being denied by the Smurls and the Warrens, went so far as to offer to pay the family to spend a week in a hotel with private security while their team investigated the home. This would include free psychiatric examinations for them, as Jack Smurl had told a newspaper reporter He had surgery to remove water from his brain in 1983 because he had been experiencing short-term memory loss due to a case of meningitis in his youth. This purportedly offended the Smurls, who chose instead to continue to work with the Warrens and Bishop McKenna. Undaunted, two psychop investigators showed up at the Smurl house, but were turned away. Paul Kurtz, chairman of the group, wrote in the Skeptical Inquirer in an editorial titled, "A Haunting in West Pittston, Not a Ghost of a Chance," that this suggested the case was not legitimate, and by denying access, they were uninterested in arriving at the truth. He cited discrepancies in some of Don's accounts, and was especially derisive of the Warrens' involvement, offering alternate reasons for the activity like abandoned mines settling resulting in odd noises, a broken sewer pipe neighbors had previously complained about that caused the rank odors, teenagers pulling a prank on the family, and Jack's sexual assault claims being the result of delusions. Interestingly, the Smurls did give one of the teams permission to investigate the claims, and Psychop tenaciously interviewed the Smurls, neighbors, and reporters working on the case by phone, though they never set foot in the house. Kurtz went on to point out there were no police records of visits to the house, despite Janet Smurl's claims of contacting them in the past. Most damaging were reports that the Smurls were already speaking to film companies once their story hit the press, but they denied having any interest in profiting from their situation. Exacerbating the situation was a press conference called by Ed Warren, who informed the gathering that audio recordings of disembodied groans and grunts had been made, as well as video of a shadowy mass moving about the house, but couldn't make them available as he had given them to a TV production company whose name he couldn't recall. He told others, including Psychop, they were in possession of the church, who later claimed they had received nothing from the Warrens. By now acting as the family spokesperson, Warren rebuffed reporters' requests to stay inside the house, pointedly saying none of them took the Smurls up on the offer to do so some time ago. Ed claimed he was now the sole investigator on the case, and all inquiries should be directed to him and not the family. For their part, the Smurls contacted a medium for a fresh perspective. Her name was Mary Alice Rinkman, and she corroborated the Warrens' claim of 4 spirits present, but went a step further by naming names. One was an old woman named Abigail, while a mustachioed man named Patrick had murdered his wife and her lover and been hung by an angry mob. A third was not identifiable, but she confirmed the fourth was indeed a demon. The incessant press coverage forced the hand of the Scranton Diocese, who with great lack of enthusiasm agreed to intervene in the case. Meanwhile, the Warrens planned to bring in several priests to conduct a mass exorcism. Prayer groups were welcomed in to offer reassurance and support. Reverend Alphonsus Trebold of St. Bonaventure University was selected by the diocese to conduct their inquiry, and reported that while he believed the Smurls were sincere and unnerved by the chain of events, he could not conclude that a demonic force was the catalyst. In an interview with Jill Stefko of Decoded in 2014, Reverend Trebold claimed he had previously worked with the Warrens until deciding, in his words, they weren't sincere and were prone to sensationalizing. He further claimed when attending one of their lectures, they saw him and toned down their act, so to speak, so he would take to wearing disguises when attending after that. Bishop McKenna returned for a third round in the fall of 1986, and this time the exorcism seemed to have made a difference, with calm presiding over the house for a 3-month span of time. But by Christmas the dark form appeared again to Jack, who clutched a rosary and prayed, hoping this was not the start of another cycle of terror. But the noises, odors, and brutality began anew. In this time frame, a priest from the Scranton Diocese spent 2 nights at the Smurl home, and later reported nothing unusual happening during his stay. The Smurls would eventually move back to Wilkes-Barre, and a fourth exorcism, this time conducted by the church, seemed to end their ordeal and bring peace to them. The Reverend Joseph Adonizio, pastor of Immaculate Conception Parish in West Pittston, said in an October 28, 1986 article that prayers have chased the foul smells and violent demons from the West Pittston home, and that they felt that after their intense prayers in the church and through the prayers of the congregation, things are back to normal. Within days of the Smurl story making national news, an anonymous source witnessed Jack negotiating with Scranton businessman Ralph Loma, who headed up the Star Group, a film production company. While Jack denied doing so, Loma confirmed he indeed attempted to secure exclusive rights to their story. In November, St. Martin's Press announced a book deal with the Smurls. The book detailing their nightmare was titled The Haunted, and a movie adaptation of the same name would follow in 1991. A woman named Deborah Owens moved into the former Smurl home in 1988 and told reporters she never encountered anything supernatural while living there. Karen Smurl, now a social worker and occasional paranormal investigator, remembers people knocking on windows and doors and even throwing bricks at their house. When asked about the allegations of seeking fame and profit from their story, she said, "We never made money from the book or movie. Who would want to go through all that media and public bashing? To the naysayers, I hope it doesn't take something as extreme as what we went through to make them believers. We wouldn't wish our experiences on anyone." There is one common denominator in this story and others I've covered, and that's the presence of the Warrens. So that leads to a little bit of a conundrum. Are high-profile hauntings a direct result of their involvement in them? Or are they just constantly summoned to those types of things? Ed and Lorraine certainly have their detractors, mainly because of the seemingly constant presence of the demonic. But in fairness, how many cases have they ever deemed non-paranormal? Because we'll never see those in a book or on film. And you can certainly make a case for potentially something unsavory happening when any haunting finds its way into print or to the big screen. And you can also question the Smurls' decision to go public with this, as those things normally don't turn out very well. Although it did coerce the church into finally providing the assistance that the family had long sought for. Normally I like to give the benefit of the doubt to the petitioners, but I only wish there was more audio and visual documentation of the residual effects of this haunting that, after all, took place in the 1970s and the 1980s. The Smurls certainly seem believable, but unfortunately outside involvements resulted in serious doubts about their claims. And that's too bad, because we'll never quite know who was haunted here, the house they lived in, or perhaps the family themselves.